The decision to fly to Houston was not planned. It came on a restless Thursday evening when silence had stretched far too long. My son, Rashad, had always been quick to return my calls. Even when life was busy, even when his career kept him stretched thin, he never let more than a day pass without checking in on me. But now it had been nearly a week. The texts I received were short, rushed, clipped in a way that unsettled me. And the one person who should have reassured me, his wife, Marvette, only made my suspicions grow deeper. Her tone on the phone was cold, dismissive, like she wanted me off the line as quickly as possible. Something inside told me this silence wasn't natural. I didn't bother calling again. I didn't announce my trip. I simply packed a small bag, booked the next flight, and boarded the plane. I told myself I was being cautious, that perhaps Rashad was busy or traveling himself. But the truth is, a mother knows when something is wrong. And this wasn't worry without reason. It was instinct. The flight stretched long. I stared out of the window, replaying the last few months in my mind. Marvette had grown more distant at family gatherings, less engaged with Rashad's side of the family, and her priorities seemed shifted elsewhere. I had caught hints of tension between them, but chalked it up to the natural bumps of marriage. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of the last time I saw her face to face, her eyes darting away when I asked about their future plans, her smile too thin, her responses too sharp. When the plane touched down in Houston, my chest tightened. The evening air was heavy, but not as heavy as the thought that waited for me. I didn't go to their home. I went straight to the hospital. I can't explain what guided me there, but it was the same voice that told me to fly in the first place. At the reception desk, I asked for my son. The nurse's face shifted, her lips pressing together before she pointed me toward intensive care. My knees almost buckled. ICU? Rashad? The words didn't make sense together. But when I walked into that unit, reality slammed me hard. My son, my strong, vibrant Rashad, lay motionless, surrounded by tubes and machines, his chest rising and falling only because of the equipment keeping him alive. In that moment, the world blurred. My hands gripped the side of the hospital bed, my eyes refusing to accept what they saw. This was not the man I raised, the man full of ambition and life. I asked the nurses how long he'd been there, and the answer broke me. Nearly a week. A week of silence, a week of suffering. And no one had told me. I'll introduce myself properly now. My name is Odessa Claiborne, and I am Rashad's mother, the woman who bore him, who raised him, who knows his laugh, his habits, his resilience, and now the woman who stood helpless as she saw her only son fighting for his life alone. Before I continue, let me pause to ask you, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I ask this because no matter where you are in the world, betrayal, grief, and revenge are languages we all understand. And as you hear my story, I want you to feel it not as a tale of strangers, but as if it were happening in your own family. The drive from the airport to the hospital was quiet, my thoughts loud enough to drown out the hum of the city. I had come on instinct, and now that instinct was leading me straight through the glass doors of the hospital, past the front desk, and toward the wing they told me to find. My hands shook as I signed my name on the visitor log, but my legs carried me forward anyway. The smell of disinfectant and the low hum of machines filled the air as I entered the intensive care unit. It was there that my world stopped. Rashad lay stretched on a hospital bed, tubes threaded into his arms, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm beneath the support of machines. My son, the boy I once rocked to sleep, the man who had carried himself with pride and laughter, was now silent, his body fragile in ways I never thought I'd see. The nurse at the station caught sight of me and quickly came over. She lowered her voice as she explained that he had collapsed from severe hypertension, his condition worsened by prolonged stress. He had been here for nearly a week, drifting in and out of consciousness. Nearly a week, and I hadn't been told. My heart twisted as I thought of all the hours I could have been at his side, but wasn't, all because no one had picked up the phone to call me. As I stood there, frozen between disbelief and grief, I couldn't help but notice the way the nurses exchanged glances. Their faces carried something unspoken, a story they weren't telling outright. I caught pieces of it in their hushed whispers when they thought I couldn't hear. She hasn't been here. It's been days. And can you imagine? Off traveling while he's like this. I didn't ask them to repeat it. I didn't press for details just yet. But I heard enough to know those words weren't meant for strangers. They were about someone close to Rashad. And the absence in this room, the missing figure who should have been by his side, his wife, confirmed exactly who they meant. I pulled a chair up to his bed and sat there, my hand wrapping around his. His skin was cool, but I held him anyway, whispering his name, though I knew he couldn't respond. This was not how I imagined finding my son. I had flown here thinking maybe he was working too hard, maybe I'd surprise him with dinner, or just the comfort of his mother's presence. Instead, I found him fighting for his life, abandoned by the one who vowed to stand beside him in sickness and in health. I stayed by his side, my eyes darting between the man lying in the bed and the machines that kept him alive. But my mind replayed the nurse's words over and over. The truth was beginning to surface, not in full yet, but in cracks and whispers. Something wasn't right. And while I sat in that chair, clutching Rashad's hand, I knew this hospital room held more than just a sick man. It held the first proof of betrayal. And I would not leave without uncovering every piece of it. The whispers I overheard in the ICU stayed with me long after I left my son's bedside to clear my head. Nurses don't speak lightly about patients' families, and the pity in their voices told me more than they realized. She hasn't been here. She's away traveling. Those words circled in my mind like vultures. Traveling where? And with what conscience could a wife abandon her husband in this condition? I didn't confront them. I simply listened, and as I lingered near the desk, a younger nurse's voice confirmed what I dreaded. She's in Paris right now. Can you imagine? My chest tightened. Paris, a vacation overseas, while Rashad lay unconscious, tethered to machines. I kept my composure until I stepped outside the ICU doors. The cool air in the hallway steadied me. I knew suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. I needed proof, hard proof, and I was determined to find it. I called an old friend of Rashad's, someone I trusted, and asked him to meet me later that evening. With his help, I accessed some of the recent account records. What I saw on those statements nearly broke me. Thousands of dollars charged to luxury hotels and restaurants in Paris. Designer boutiques with totals that made my stomach twist. All of it funneled out of Rashad's own accounts, the same accounts that should have been paying his hospital bills, not fueling a holiday across the ocean. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial, calculated, deliberate. My son had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to see his money squandered like this. Every line item felt like a slap. Champagne dinners, jewelry purchases, five-star accommodations. My eyes scanned the receipts one after another, each one hammering home the same reality. Marvette was not at his side. She was living lavishly in Paris while he hovered between life and death. And worse, she hadn't done it quietly. Her social media, though locked down to most, still left traces that couldn't be erased. A tagged photo here, a check-in there. I didn't need to see her smiling face under the Eiffel Tower to know the truth. The charges alone told the whole story. I thought back to the cold tone she used when I last called, the hurried excuses, the clipped responses. Now, they made perfect sense. She wasn't too busy to speak. She was too distracted by another life, a life she chose over my son. I sat in silence for a long time with those receipts spread across the table. Pain and fury fought for dominance inside me, but above both came clarity. This wasn't neglect by accident. This was betrayal by choice. She had left him to wither in a hospital bed while she burned through his finances with no shame. The proof was now in my hands. Marvette was not just absent. She was indulging herself on Rashad's dime in one of the world's most expensive cities. And in that moment, I realized my fight would not just be for my son's dignity, but for his very legacy. I folded those records neatly, slid them into my bag, and returned to the hospital. When I sat back down by Rashad's side, I leaned close and whispered, "Don't worry, son. I see the truth now, and I won't let her get away with it." The betrayal was no longer hidden. It had a name, a location, and a price tag. Paris. And every dollar she spent there would cost her far more than she could ever imagine. The receipts alone had been enough to shake me, but the question still clawed at me. Who was she with in Paris? Marvette had never been bold enough to travel overseas alone, not on a trip so extravagant. Someone was footing part of that bill. Someone was standing beside her when those pictures were taken. Someone was her partner in betrayal. I didn't have to wait long before the answer surfaced. One of the receipts carried not just her name, but an additional charge, listed under a joint reservation. The surname leapt from the page like a knife to my chest. Reddick. At first, I thought it might be coincidence, a stranger, a business associate. But then the memory clicked into place, a memory etched into my life forever. Kelvin Reddick, Rashad's oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him years ago as his best man, smiling proudly as my son vowed his life to Marvette. My stomach churned. Betrayal by a wife was one thing, but betrayal by a friend, by the very man Rashad had trusted enough to place at his side on the most important day of his life, cut deeper than words could capture. I closed my eyes, and the flashback came without mercy. I could see Rashad standing tall at the altar, his nerves hidden behind that smile only a mother can read. And there, right beside him, Kelvin in a tailored suit, clapping him on the shoulder, speaking words of encouragement. A toast later at the reception. To loyalty, to brotherhood, to love everlasting. How hollow those words ring now. I remembered Kelvin laughing with the family, dancing with Marvette like an old friend, blending seamlessly into the celebration. Rashad had trusted him like a brother, and I had welcomed him like a son. And all the while, perhaps even then, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. The image of Paris became sharper. Marvette wasn't just vacationing. She was parading around the city with the very man Rashad had once called his closest friend. Every hotel room charged, every fine dinner booked, every jewel purchased was a shared indulgence between two people who should have been at his bedside. Instead, they were living their secret openly, without shame, because they believed he wouldn't notice, because he was too weak, too distracted, too trusting. I thought back to the last holiday gathering where Kelvin had been present. The way his eyes lingered a little too long on Marvette when he thought no one was looking. The subtleties between them, disguised as familiarity. My mind replayed those details I had brushed aside. How could I have missed it? The truth is, you never want to suspect betrayal from those you consider family. And yet here it was, undeniable, written in transactions and whispered by fate. I sat in the hospital chapel that night, the quiet pressing down on me, and I whispered to myself, it's him. It's been him all along. The grief over Rashad's condition swelled inside me, but alongside it, something harder began to form, a promise. Not only would Marvette answer for abandoning him, but Kelvin Reddick, the best man who betrayed his best friend, would be exposed as well. The betrayal was no longer just marital. It was fraternal. It was layered in lies, built on the ruins of trust Rashad had poured into both of them. And as I prepared to face the days ahead, I knew this wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about dismantling the false foundation they had built together. Kelvin's name was now etched in the story. The man who once toasted to loyalty would soon face the weight of his disloyalty. And I, Odessa Claiborne, would make sure of it. The weight of betrayal by both Marvette and Kelvin gnawed at me, but the truth of Rashad's collapse still demanded answers. I needed to know what had pushed him into the ICU, why his strong body had failed him so suddenly. When I pressed the attending physician for details, the explanation was blunt. Years of untreated hypertension worsened by relentless stress. My son had worked himself raw, carrying burdens too heavy for one man, while the woman who should have been easing those burdens was draining him further into despair. I left the hospital and drove straight to Rashad's house that evening, letting myself in with the spare key he had given me long ago. The silence inside was crushing. Piles of unopened mail covered the entry table, bills stacked so high they seemed ready to topple. I began opening them one by one, and my heart sank with each envelope. Past due notices from the electric company, letters threatening foreclosure, credit cards marked final warning, medical bills that had been ignored until collection agencies were now chasing them down. It became clear Rashad's body hadn't failed him by chance. The weight of these financial burdens had been grinding him down until his heart simply gave way. The son I raised to be disciplined and hard-working had been suffocating under debt, all while his wife siphoned away the very money that could have kept him afloat. I sat at the dining room table, receipts and letters spread around me like the pieces of a puzzle. The picture they formed was devastating. Rashad's income had been steady enough, but every time he gained ground, another withdrawal, another charge from Marvette sent him tumbling backward. Designer bags, fine jewelry, exotic spas. It was all right there, inked in the cruel black and red of statements. The same accounts that should have been used to pay insurance premiums or keep the mortgage current had instead been poured into her indulgences. What cut deepest was the timeline. Several of the largest charges aligned almost perfectly with the weeks leading to Rashad's collapse. While he was buckling under the strain of mounting debt, she was planning her escape. The contrast was merciless. One spouse fighting for survival, the other sipping champagne overseas with his so-called best friend. I remembered Rashad's voice during our last real conversation, the heaviness in his words. He had brushed it off as work stress, but now I understood. The weight wasn't just his career. It was the crushing combination of financial ruin and betrayal within his own home. He had been pushed past the edge by the very people who should have been his support. The house itself reflected the neglect. Past due notices for property taxes lay unopened, and eviction threats were tucked beneath pizza coupons and junk mail. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was abandonment of responsibility. Marvette hadn't cared if the roof over their heads was at risk, as long as her own luxuries remained secure. By the time I gathered the paperwork into a neat folder, the fury in me had shifted into something sharper. Grief and anger were now aligning with resolve. Rashad had collapsed under the pressure of debts he shouldn't have carried alone. His health had been chipped away by the toxic weight of betrayal disguised as love. I whispered to myself as I tucked the folder into my bag. She thought she could drain him dry and then run, but she has no idea what I'm about to do. The financial trail told me everything I needed. This wasn't just marital failure. This was calculated ruin. And if Marvette believed she could enjoy Paris while Rashad's life crumbled here, she was about to learn that every dollar she stole would cost her tenfold. Anger could have driven me to pick up the phone and unleash every ounce of fury on Marvette right then. But grief and anger alone don't secure justice. I knew if I confronted her too soon, she would cover her tracks, shift blame, and still find a way to profit from Rashad's suffering. No, this battle had to be fought with precision. Revenge without strategy is just noise. I needed something permanent, something binding, something that would strip her of every avenue she thought she had. That evening, I gathered every piece of documentation I had collected, the hospital bills, the unpaid mortgage notices, the bank statements with Paris charges, and the receipts that carried her name alongside Kelvin's. I placed them neatly into a binder, each one a nail in the coffin of the life she had built on my son's back. Then I made a call to an attorney recommended by an old friend. His office was downtown, the kind of place that thrived on handling family disputes, estates, and guardianships. Exactly what I needed. The following morning, I walked into that law office with my binder pressed tightly to my chest. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man who didn't waste words, listened carefully as I laid everything out. He didn't flinch at my pain. Instead, he asked the right questions. How long had Rashad been incapacitated? Who currently controlled the finances? What assets were at risk? I answered each one, sliding evidence across the desk until the picture was clear. Rashad's wife had abandoned him, drained his accounts, and left him in medical crisis while she jetted off overseas. The attorney leaned back, tapped his pen against his notepad, and told me something I already suspected. As Rashad's mother, I had legal grounds to petition the court for temporary guardianship over his financial affairs while he remained incapacitated. With proof of neglect and financial abuse, the court would almost certainly favor me, at least until Rashad could speak for himself again. That was all I needed to hear. We moved quickly. Paperwork was drafted that same day. I signed each page with a hand that trembled, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what I was setting in motion. These weren't just documents. They were the first steps in dismantling Marvette's entire illusion of control. Once filed, she would find herself locked out of every account she thought was hers to squander. As I left the office, clutching the stamped copies, I felt a calm settle over me. It wasn't peace, not yet. My son was still lying in ICU, and his life still hung in the balance. But it was control. For the first time since I walked into that hospital room, I wasn't just reacting. I was moving. Quietly, deliberately, I was shifting the ground beneath Marvette's feet. That night, back at Rashad's bedside, I looked at him differently. He remained unconscious, the machines steady in their rhythm, but I whispered to him anyway, "Don't you worry, son. I've started the process. She won't take another dime from you. Not now, not ever." The nurses probably thought I was just another grieving mother talking to her child. They didn't know the truth. Those papers already filed at the courthouse were the silent strike that would change everything. And when Marvette's world began to unravel, she wouldn't even see it coming. The petition moved through the system faster than I expected. By the next morning, a judge had signed the temporary guardianship order, granting me full control of Rashad's finances while he lay incapacitated in the ICU. It was a simple document, just a few pages of legal language, but to me it felt like a weapon. I had asked the lawyer one question before I left his office. How long will it take before she feels it? His answer was firm, 24 hours at most. And he was right. That very evening, as I sat by Rashad's bedside, I imagined the scene unfolding across the ocean. Marvette, dressed in the kind of silk blouse my son had likely paid for, striding into a Paris boutique with Kelvin at her side. The cashier swiping her platinum card, only for the screen to flash declined. The confusion on her face, the attempt to laugh it off, the swipe again, and still declined. The call started almost immediately, first to the bank, then to me. I didn't answer. Her voice filled my voicemail box with rising panic, first sweet and pleading, then sharp and venomous. "Odessa, what did you do? Don't you dare touch what isn't yours." The irony made me smirk bitterly. What wasn't mine? It had never been hers to begin with. Reports trickled back to me through family friends who kept an eye on her social media. She and Kelvin had been staying in a luxury hotel, but once the charges stopped clearing, the hotel staff demanded another form of payment. She didn't have it. Kelvin argued with her in the lobby, his voice raised, his temper breaking through the polished image he once kept. He wasn't there for her. He was there for the money. And now that the money was gone, the cracks between them widened fast. By midnight, I heard she had been forced out of the hotel altogether, luggage piled at her feet, her voice shrill as she argued with Kelvin on the sidewalk. Stranded in one of the most expensive cities in the world, she had no idea that the ground beneath her had shifted because of me, because of the very woman she thought she could ignore. The next day, more voicemails came. This time, her voice cracked with desperation. She claimed she didn't know how to pay for her flight home, how to cover her meals, how to even get around. And still, she never once asked about Rashad. Not once. Every word was about her money, her inconvenience, her humiliation. It was proof enough she hadn't loved him, not in sickness, not in health. She had loved the lifestyle, and now that was gone. Meanwhile, I sat at my son's bedside, his hand in mine, the steady beep of the machines filling the silence. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. My revenge was already working for me, quietly, legally, powerfully. Marvette's Parisian fantasy had collapsed within 24 hours. And it was only the beginning. When money dries up, love dries up with it. That was the lesson Marvette learned in Paris. And I could almost hear the bitterness in her voice as she left me voicemails she thought would move me. But the reports I received painted a different story, one that told me her carefully constructed fantasy was crumbling faster than even I expected. Kelvin Reddick, the man Rashad once trusted with his secrets, his friendship, and the role of best man, had been bold enough to share a bed with my son's wife. He had been shameless enough to walk with her through Paris streets on Rashad's dime. But now, with the accounts frozen and the funds locked tight, he revealed what he truly was, a parasite without loyalty. The hotel lobby incident had only been the start. By the second day of declined cards, Kelvin's demeanor shifted completely. Witnesses said his voice turned sharp, his hand gestures wild as he blamed Marvette for bringing this mess on him. The so-called romance that had pulled her across an ocean dissolved into screaming arguments in public. Paris pedestrians glanced their way, not knowing the story, but seeing the cracks between two people who should never have been together in the first place. I didn't need to be there to know it was happening. The signs came to me through other channels. A cousin of Rashad's who worked in banking forwarded me official receipts flagged for fraud review, all tied to Paris transactions. Another relative sent me screenshots, leaked photos from social media where Marvette had been tagged against her will. There she was, champagne glass in hand, Kelvin's arm around her waist, their smiles brazen. And the timestamp? The very same night Rashad had been admitted to the ICU. Those images, those receipts were the kind of evidence you can't argue against. They were undeniable proof of abandonment, of infidelity, of financial exploitation. With them in my possession, I no longer had to rely on whispers or speculation. I had the facts, hard, cold facts that would burn through any defense she tried to mount later. But what struck me most was the timing of Kelvin's abandonment. Once the accounts froze, once the meals and rooms could no longer be purchased, he began to distance himself. He refused to pay out of pocket, claiming he hadn't planned for this. The man who toasted to loyalty on Rashad's wedding day vanished the moment his own pockets were threatened. He wasn't her savior. He wasn't her partner. He was simply another wolf snapping at her until he realized the carcass was picked clean. By the third day, I heard through another whisper that Kelvin had left her altogether, checked into another hotel under his own name, leaving Marvette stranded with her luggage and her shame. Her dream had collapsed into a nightmare. Abandoned in Paris, funds gone, lover gone, reputation unraveling. I sat in the hospital with Rashad, my phone buzzing with each new piece of proof that found its way into my hands. Photos, statements, receipts. Every one of them was a weapon waiting to be used. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I only whispered again to my son. It's all coming together, Rashad. Everything she thought she gained will be the very thing that destroys her. Kelvin had abandoned her, yes, but I wouldn't. I would stay with Rashad until the end. And when the end came, the world would see exactly what kind of woman Marvette truly was. Back in Houston, the days blurred together in a rhythm of exhaustion. My mornings began in the courthouse or in my lawyer's office, signing papers, reviewing documents, collecting every strand of proof that tied Marvette to betrayal. By afternoon, I was back in the ICU, holding Rashad's hand, whispering words into an ear that could no longer answer me. Nights, I sat awake in his quiet house, surrounded by piles of debt notices and photographs of happier times, refusing to let despair paralyze me. Grief pressed on me from one side, determination from the other, and I walked a tightrope between them. But it wasn't only me who felt the weight of what was happening. Whispers had begun to spread through the family. Cousins, aunts, and close friends who had always loved Rashad now spoke in low tones when they called or visited. "Have you seen her?" they'd ask me, their voices layered with suspicion. "Why hasn't Marvette been here? Why hasn't she shown her face?" No one wanted to believe it at first, but each day that passed without her presence at Rashad's bedside made the truth harder to ignore. Even neighbors stopped by the hospital once or twice, their brows furrowed, their voices hushed. "It doesn't make sense," one of them told me. "She's never here. I've seen you every day, but her, not once." Their words weren't meant to wound me, but they did. They confirmed what I already knew. Marvette had chosen her own pleasures over her vows, and everyone around us was beginning to see it for themselves. The scandal brewed like a storm cloud. It hadn't yet broken open in full, but its shadows stretched across Houston. I overheard relatives on the phone, careful with their words, but not their judgments. "She's not here because she doesn't care," one whispered when she thought I was out of earshot. "She's out there living while he's in here, dying." The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was public. And soon, there would be no corner for her to hide in. Meanwhile, the paperwork multiplied. Guardianship was already granted, but the debts required careful sorting. Foreclosure warnings needed responses. Insurance claims demanded signatures. And the hospital pressed me daily about costs. I fought on all fronts, using every ounce of energy to keep Rashad's life from unraveling further while he lay unconscious. Each signature I gave, each phone call I answered, was a reminder that his wife had abandoned these duties along with him. Still, no matter how heavy the load, I never let Rashad sit alone. Even when I dragged myself into the ICU with papers tucked under my arm, I sat beside him until my eyes closed from fatigue. Nurses noticed, too. One of them leaned in softly one night and said, "You're here more than anyone else. He knows that. He can feel it." I nodded, though my heart ached at the thought that the one person who should have been there wasn't. Family whispers grew into murmurs, murmurs into questions, and questions into outrage. I didn't feed it yet. I didn't share the Paris receipts or the photos with them. That time would come. For now, I let their own suspicions build naturally, because when the truth was finally revealed, the impact would be devastating. So I kept my silence, balancing between the weight of Rashad's condition and the legal war I was waging. On the surface, I was simply a grieving mother. Beneath it, I was a strategist sharpening my weapons. And all the while, the city around me began to murmur the same thing I already knew. Rashad was not only abandoned, he was betrayed. The machines had become the rhythm of my days. The steady beeps, the soft hiss of oxygen, the low hum of monitors, they were the soundtrack of my vigil. I had grown used to them, almost comforted by their constancy, because each sound meant Rashad was still with me, still fighting in his silence. But no machine can hold back what is inevitable forever. It happened on a quiet morning. I had been at his side all night, my hand clasping his, my eyes heavy from hours of watching every rise and fall of his chest. The nurses came and went, adjusting tubes, checking vitals, their faces neutral, but their eyes betraying sympathy. I had seen that look too many times not to understand. They knew what was coming. The doctor came in around dawn, his voice calm, but final. Rashad's body was failing. The damage from his collapse, compounded by years of stress and untreated illness, had taken its toll. There were no more interventions left to try, no miracles waiting on the other side of those machines. I nodded, even as my heart screamed in denial. I leaned close to Rashad, my voice trembling. "I'm here, son. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." My tears fell onto his hand, but I held him steady, refusing to let go. If this was to be his last breath, I would make sure it wasn't taken in loneliness. And then it came. The monitors slowed, the beeps stretched apart, and finally, silence filled the room where sound had lived for so long. My boy, my Rashad, was gone. Grief tore through me, sharp and merciless, but alongside the pain was a deeper truth that burned into me. He had not been abandoned in that moment. His wife was nowhere to be found. Yes, she was thousands of miles away, chasing a fantasy in Paris, blind to the man she had promised to love. But I was there. I, Odessa Claiborne, sat beside my son until his very last breath. The contrast was unbearable. On one side of the world, his wife laughed over wine glasses with another man. On this side, I held his hand as his life slipped away. One woman had abandoned him in his darkest hour. Another, his mother, had stayed, loyal to the end. The cruel irony of it only sharpened my resolve. I stayed long after the machines were turned off, after the nurses had drawn the curtain, and the doctor had left the room. I stayed because letting go felt like betrayal itself. My hand remained on his chest where warmth still lingered, and I whispered, "You weren't alone, Rashad. You'll never be alone, not as long as I have breath." When I finally rose, I carried not just the weight of grief, but the weight of purpose. Rashad's death was not an ending. It was the spark that would ignite the final stages of my revenge. Because while he had died with loyalty by his side, Marvette would live with nothing but the consequences of her disloyalty. I walked out of that ICU knowing the war wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The week that followed Rashad's passing was a blur of arrangements no mother should ever have to make. Choosing a casket, selecting the flowers, writing the obituary. Each decision felt like driving a nail into my own chest. Yet through every painful step, one choice was clear to me. Marvette's name would not appear anywhere. She had forfeited that right the moment she chose Paris over her dying husband. When the obituary was drafted, I read it over and over, ensuring each word reflected Rashad's life, his character, his love for family. I listed the names of those who survived him, his mother, his siblings, his cousins, but I left hers out completely. She was erased as if she had never belonged, because in truth, she never had. Her absence was not just physical, it was spiritual, moral, complete. The newspaper printed it exactly as I submitted. And when people read it, they noticed. They always notice. The day of the funeral, the church was filled to its walls. Friends, neighbors, extended family all came to honor Rashad. Many of them had seen him grow from a boy into a man, and they came with heavy hearts to pay their respects. But in the midst of grief, there was another presence in the air, a quiet confusion, a curiosity, whispers that spread from pew to pew. "Where is Marvette?" One voice murmured. "Why isn't she listed in the paper?" Another whispered. Some assumed she was too overcome with grief to appear. Others knew better. They had seen me at that hospital every day. They had seen her nowhere. Her absence screamed louder than any accusation I could make. When the service began, I stood with strength I didn't know I had. I spoke about Rashad, his kindness, his laughter, his loyalty. I spoke about his sacrifices, his hard work, his dreams. The congregation wept with me, nodded with me, mourned with me. But through it all, not one mention of a wife crossed my lips. Not in the eulogy, not in the program, not in the prayers. She was cut away like rot from fruit, unworthy of being tied to his memory. Outside the church, after the burial, the questions grew bolder. Odessa, is she even here in town? What kind of woman doesn't come to her own husband's funeral? I didn't answer directly. I didn't need to. The silence itself was an indictment. People filled the gaps with their own conclusions, and every one of them painted her in shame. The truth was, she was still overseas then, scrambling to salvage her trip, her pride, her life. She wasn't mourning Rashad. She was mourning her empty accounts, her abandoned lover, her ruined facade. And while she wallowed in her downfall, I buried my son with dignity, surrounded by love, respect, and truth, not by pretense and betrayal. As I stood by the graveside, watching the earth cover the coffin, I whispered one final promise to Rashad. I gave you the send-off you deserved. Not the mockery she would have made it. This was about you, and only you. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers still trailing the air. They would all go home and talk about what they saw, what they didn't see, and what it all meant. Marvette's absence wasn't just noted. It was seared into memory. She wasn't the grieving widow people expected. She was the missing ghost, the woman who proved herself guilty by not even showing up. And that was exactly how I wanted it. By the time Marvette finally returned from Paris, the damage was already done. Rashad had been buried, his name spoken over with dignity, his memory honored without hers attached to it. She stepped back into Houston not as a grieving widow, but as a woman stripped of her standing, stripped of her comforts, and about to face a reckoning she never saw coming. When she pulled up to the house, luggage in tow, she expected the same life she had left behind. A roof over her head, keys that turned smoothly in the lock, credit cards that answered to her swipe. What she found instead was silence and steel. The locks had been changed. Her key no longer worked, and the account she reached for, the ones she had used to fund her trip of betrayal, were still frozen tight under my guardianship order. She banged on the door, called my phone, left messages dripping with outrage. You can't do this to me. Odessa, this is my home too. These are my accounts too. But her cries meant nothing. Every document, every court signature said otherwise. She was locked out literally and legally. What she didn't expect was the wall of family she would face next. When she tried to go to Rashad's cousins for sympathy, they shut their doors. When she showed up at his aunt's home, demanding to know why she hadn't been told of the funeral, the response was blunt. You weren't here when he needed you. Why should you be here now? Those words spread through the family like wildfire, and one by one, they turned their backs. Even in the neighborhood, eyes followed her with judgment. Whispers curled in every corner. That's the wife who didn't show up. That's the one who was away while he died. Her absence at Rashad's bedside and at his burial wasn't a secret anymore. It was her reputation burned into memory. She tried to play the victim, crying about being left out of decisions, painting me as the cold mother-in-law who had stolen control. But the proof had already spoken louder than any performance. Photos of her in Paris with Kelvin had reached hands beyond mine. Receipts with her name on them had circulated through family. The narrative she tried to spin collapsed under the weight of evidence no one could deny. One afternoon, she arrived at the hospital hoping to retrieve some of Rashad's belongings. I was there, waiting. She tried to force her way into a confrontation, her voice shrill, her accusations sharp. But when other family members stepped forward, Rashad's cousins, his uncle, even an old family friend, she found herself surrounded not by support, but by rejection. "You left him," one of them said. "You don't deserve to speak his name." She stormed off in humiliation, but the sting of those words would follow her. That night, as I sat in Rashad's empty home, I reflected on what she had walked into. No husband, no home, no accounts, no family to lean on. The fortress she thought she built with lies and indulgence had turned into a prison of isolation. And all of it, every lock, every frozen dollar, every whispered judgment, was justice tightening around her neck. The truth was no longer hidden in Parisian hotel rooms. It was out in the open, and everyone could see who she really was. And for me, this was only another step in a revenge that was far from finished. It didn't take long for Marvette to make her move. Stripped of access to the house, rejected by family, and humiliated in the community, she turned to the only weapon she had left, the courts. As Rashad's legal widow, she believed she could still assert control over his estate, reclaim the accounts I had frozen, and undo everything I had put in place. She walked into the courthouse draped in black, her face painted with a performance of grief, and filed her petition to take full control as next of kin. But I had been waiting for her. I came prepared, carrying the binder that had grown heavier with every piece of evidence I'd collected. Receipts, statements, affidavits, all neatly organized, ready to strip away the mask she wore. My lawyer and I walked into that courtroom, not as victims of her betrayal, but as prosecutors of her hypocrisy. When the hearing began, she played her part well. She told the judge she had been absent because she was emotionally overwhelmed. She claimed she had traveled for clarity and healing. Her voice cracked on cue. Her eyes glistened with manufactured tears. For a moment, I could see the performance sway a few in the gallery, but not the judge, and certainly not me. When it was our turn, I opened the binder. One by one, we laid the evidence on the table. Hotel invoices with her signature, time-stamped during Rashad's ICU stay. Credit card statements showing purchases at Paris boutiques, jewelry stores, luxury restaurants. Photographs tagged on social media of her and Kelvin clinking glasses beneath the Eiffel Tower. And testimonies from nurses who confirmed her absence, from family who had seen me at the hospital every day, from neighbors who witnessed her neglect. The courtroom grew heavier with each piece revealed. The performance she had staged collapsed under the weight of facts she could not deny. Every attempt she made to interrupt was silenced by the judge, who leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Claiborne, is this your signature? Is this your name on these charges? Were you in Paris while your husband lay in intensive care?" Her answers stumbled, faltered, contradicted one another. The judge's tone hardened, and then, with finality, the gavel of truth struck. He ruled in my favor, granting me permanent control over Rashad's estate, denying her petitions outright. The accounts remained frozen under my guardianship, and the house was secured beyond her reach. Marvette's face drained of color as the words sank in. She had come to the courtroom believing she could win on title alone. Widow, but titles mean nothing when stripped of loyalty. In the eyes of the law, she was still his wife. But in the eyes of justice, she was nothing more than a deserter who had squandered every right she might have had. As we left the courthouse, family members surrounded me with quiet support. Marvette stood alone on the steps, her head bowed, her phone buzzing in her hand with no calls she could answer. For the first time, the world she had built for herself with lies and indulgence had been publicly dismantled. And I knew this was only part of her undoing, because while the courtroom had taken her dignity and her inheritance, another truth was waiting to emerge, one that would strip away even more than money or reputation. The courtroom defeat left Marvette shattered, but humiliation alone wasn't the end of her downfall. There was one more truth waiting in the shadows, one more betrayal that would strike deeper than frozen accounts or a locked house ever could. It began with whispers, the kind that spread quickly once people sensed weakness. Word came that Kelvin Reddick, the man she had clung to in Paris, the same man Rashad had once trusted as his best friend, was facing pressures of his own. He had been cornered by questions from those who knew him, questions he could no longer dodge. It started with his employer, who had grown suspicious after seeing photos of him overseas when he was supposed to be on leave. Then family members confronted him about the scandal with Marvette, demanding answers about the relationship. With his reputation already hanging by a thread, Kelvin broke. In a desperate attempt to salvage himself, he confessed what he had hidden for years. He was HIV positive. And worse, his silence had already cost Marvette more than she could comprehend. The news reached me through the same network of voices that had fed me every breadcrumb of truth since the beginning. A cousin called, her tone hushed but urgent. "Oh, Dessa, he admitted it. Kelvin has HIV, and Marvette, she has it too." The words pierced me like glass. For a moment, I sat in silence, not out of pity for her, but out of awe at the completeness of her ruin. Betrayal had come full circle. The very man she abandoned Rashad for had left her not with love or loyalty, but with a virus that would follow her for the rest of her life. Marvette's reaction spread quickly as well. She had gone into a spiral, confronting Kelvin in public, screaming about what he had done to her. Witnesses said her voice cracked with rage, that she wept openly when he walked away from her without remorse. He had already abandoned her when the money stopped. Now he abandoned her again, this time leaving her to face a future that no amount of Paris jewelry or luxury hotels could ever brighten. When I learned the truth, I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in knowing she carried something so heavy, but there was justice in the symmetry of it. While Rashad had been drained by her neglect, she was now drained by the very man she chose over him. While she had thought she was escaping to a new life, she had shackled herself to a truth that could not be erased or hidden. I didn't need to confront her about it. The community already knew. The same whispers that had once asked where she was during Rashad's hospitalization now asked how she could have been so reckless. The woman who had strutted through Houston with pride now walked its streets with her head down, her body weakened, her spirit broken. Her collapse was final, not just financial, not just social, but physical and emotional. Every pillar she had leaned on, money, reputation, companionship, had crumbled. Kelvin had infected more than her health. He had destroyed her illusion of power. And as I sat in Rashad's quiet house, surrounded by his photos, I realized something important. I hadn't lifted a finger to deliver this last blow. Life itself had handed her the consequence. My part had been freezing the accounts, locking the doors, presenting the evidence. But this was her lover's final gift, and it sealed her fate. The woman who left her husband in ICU for champagne and deceit had returned not only with nothing, but with less than nothing, and it was a justice I could not have scripted better myself. When the dust finally settled, I sat with my lawyer one last time. Rashad was gone, but his life's work, his earnings, his house, the pieces of his estate that Marvette had tried so hard to squander, still remained, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Not for her, not even for myself, but for him, for the son who worked himself to the bone while his wife wasted what he built. We drafted the papers carefully, line by line, clause by clause. Every asset, every dollar that had once sat in those frozen accounts was redirected into a trust bearing my son's name, Rashad Claiborne's Trust, a fund dedicated to preserving his legacy to ensure that his future children, his nieces and nephews, even scholarships in his honor, would carry his name forward. Not hers. Never hers. The judge approved it with the same firmness he had shown in every ruling before. And with that, it was finished. The estate no longer dangled in limbo. It was secured, protected, placed where no greedy hand could ever reach it again. Marvette's name was absent from every page, her claims extinguished completely. Word spread quickly, and people knew. They saw the finality of it. They saw that in the end, loyalty triumphed over betrayal. Rashad would be remembered with dignity, his name attached to something lasting, not destroyed by the woman who abandoned him. As for Marvette, her future was sealed in shame. No wealth, no home, no family, no health. Just the shadow of choices that had stripped her bare. I visited Rashad's grave that afternoon, the papers tucked under my arm. I knelt and placed my hand on the cool stone, whispering, "It's done, son. I made sure of it. She will never touch what you worked for. Your name lives on, stronger than hers ever will." Then I straightened, and for the first time since I boarded that flight to Houston, I felt a measure of peace. Revenge hadn't been rage or shouting or violence. It had been foresight, patience, and the will to outlast her. By the time I was finished, Marvette had nothing left to cling to, and Rashad's name, not hers, would be the one carried forward.